Thanks so much for joining us again on the show, on the committee program with Arun Chaudhary, who is me. And now we're going to do another edition of Smart Club, and it's going to be about self-determination. And I've seen a lot of chatter when the word nationalism comes up in the chat. And I think this is sort of the crux of what we're talking about. So I hope everybody enjoys this segment, and I'm really looking forward to it. Self-determination. It's a term both simple and slippery. Woodrow Wilson and Comrade Lenin both began the 20th century by speaking about it. And by the end of that century, the words nationalism, self-determination, popular sovereignty, national liberation were all bandied about together as much a part of the anti-colonial project as of any reactionary nativist movement. In the 21st century, we have seen nationalism mainly used as a pejorative term to describe the phenomenon as exclusively bad and leading to evil, but that hardly seems fair as progressive nationalism seems once again to be on the rise to counter the new colonialism of neoliberalism. I could have probably also just said neocolonialism. With us to discuss self-determination in the 21st century are Ben Jackson, Associate Professor of Modern History at Oxford University and the author of The Case for Scottish Independence, A History of National Political Thought in Modern Scotland. And he's going to speak about the smooth democratic processes we have going on there. And then we are going to speak with Liz Castro, who's a writer and publisher and the founder of, how do you say the name of the platform? I want to make sure that I say it correctly.
I meant to give you the transliteration. It's Asheta.cat.
Asheta. And we will put a post to that. And it's a nonprofit platform promoting creation. And I hope we talk about that in a different capacity at some point in the future. And she's going to be talking about the mixed legality and protest efforts happening in Catalonia. We're making a spectrum here, as you'll see, is what I'm doing. And finally, Bujar Aruqaj, research associate and lecturer at the Institute of Sociology at the Free University of Berlin, and someone who I often turn to when I'm looking for answers on his native country of Kosovo, where, transparency alert, I work closely with the Vetvendoja movement, which actually means self-determination in Albanian, but I'm sure that will come up. So look, we don't have to look for trouble right from the beginning. We can look for things that are not controversial. And can we start just by talking about each of these places has a cultural and political history that passes muster as an independent nation? Can we just fill the listeners in? And let's start with Ben Jackson. You know, the United Kingdom is not an ancient project. Can you just talk about, just bring us a brief history up to the present?
Sure. Well, Scotland was an independent state until 1707, when it entered a union of parliaments with England and Wales and created the Kingdom of Britain. And from 1707, Scotland was an integrated part of the British political system right through the kind of high water mark of industrialisation, all the kind of modernisation of the economy and society that took place in the 19th and 20th century. And during that period, there's always been a distinct Scottish culture, distinct institutions that have existed, and that was part of the justification for the union with England, was that the idea was that this would be a kind of union that would protect the distinctiveness of Scottish society rather than being a colonial exercise where Scotland as a culture would be forcibly integrated into England. And so pretty much that was a stable political settlement right through the 19th and 20th centuries, through the creation of the welfare state in the mid-20th century. But round about the late 20th century, round about the time you get the accession to power of Margaret Thatcher, you get the start of deindustrialisation, sort of rising levels of economic inequality. Round about that time, there's a kind of reassertion of Scottish political identity that seeks greater self-determination there. And initially that is expressed as a desire for a devolved parliament within the context of the United Kingdom, which eventually bears fruit when Labour come back into office after 1997 in the Scottish Parliament, which is kind of like a sort of, in the US, I guess, like a kind of state legislature of that sort of level of powers. And so that's a kind of major step forward for Scottish self-determination. But throughout this period, there's been a party in Scotland, the Scottish National Party, that has always advocated independence. And after that devolution takes place, the Scottish National Party gradually gathers more support and eventually takes office in the Scottish Parliament, takes over the executive command of the Scottish Parliament in 2007. And from that point onwards, they're advocating for independence and the complete separation of Scotland from the United Kingdom, which even at that point in 2007 is has quite a low level of support. But by the time we get to 2014, when the Scottish National Party are able to hold a referendum on whether Scotland should be an independent nation, there is a big jump in support for independence. That referendum campaign dramatically increases the level of support for independence. It finishes with 55% in favour of staying in the UK and 45% in favour of independence. But that is a big jump compared to where the level of support used to be. And since that referendum, the Scottish National Party has been keen to have another referendum. And that's sort of where we are in Scottish politics at the moment, is this question of, should there be a second referendum? When should it happen? And we've just had a set of elections for the Scottish Parliament last week that resulted in a majority of members of the Scottish Parliament being elected who were in favour of a second referendum. That's the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Green Party, both of which are in favour of a referendum. And so now the stage is set for a big argument over the next few years about whether there should be another independence referendum.
And we'll dig into the two sides on there. But Liz, 1,000 years of Catalonian history. And yet, I think as we talked about before the referendum, it was probably something that most journalists who even cover Europe had never touched as an issue. Give us, and Ben really set you up there. Do as good a job in condensing history beautifully as he did.
He did an amazing job. Let's see if I can give you an idea of 1,000 years of Catalan history in 3 minutes or less. The legend says that Guillermo Guifré el Pelús put his hands in his blood as he was dying and put 4 fingers on his shield of blood, which are the 4 red stripes of the Catalan flag, around 988. So just to give you a kind of legendary view of the birth of Catalonia. But the truth is that Catalonia predates the Spanish state by about 500 years. And in fact, even when what we learned in grade school in the United States, Ferdinand marries Isabella. Isabella is Castile. She's the Queen of Castile. Ferdinand is the King of Aragon, which is a confederation of kingdoms of Aragon, of Catalonia, of Valencia, and of the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, Menorca, etc. And that whole confederacy is a Catalan-speaking territory. That Catalonia loses its privileges in a war in 1714. In 17. It doesn't even matter. In the early 18th century, on September 11th, it is 1714, and this is when Spain takes away Catalonia's constitution. It takes away its parliament. It takes away its representative government because Catalonia had backed the wrong king, basically, where the Spanish backed the Bourbons. At any rate, but Catalonia doesn't go away, even though it's in 1714 when Spain begins to say that Catalans are not allowed to speak Catalan. And the Catalan language is the basis for the Catalan culture, the language, the dance, the music, the food, all of the different pieces. The central piece of Catalan culture is the language. And the feeling about identity of Catalonia remains throughout these last 5 centuries, but they're always a piece of being different than the rest of Spain. And Spain wants to, as every imperialist power wants, to enclose Catalonia within it. Catalonia is a entrepreneuring, prosperous region that has always been very successful and wealthy indeed. The very first train that was built in all of Spain, including the colonies, was in between Barcelona and Mataró. It was a private venture. It wasn't a public thing. Anyway, so then I don't even know where to. There's so much to tell you in such a short amount of time. there's this dictatorship in the middle of the 20th century, and a big piece of that is also Catalonia wanting to be its own identity. That was brutally repressed by Franco for 40 years. You weren't allowed to speak the language. You weren't allowed to dance the dances. You weren't. So beating out Catalanism is a part of the quest for Spanish unity. The fact that Catalonia
Yeah, I mean, I think we see very similar things
Spain.
in Italy, especially with the Italianization, even this sort of gross paper over way. We'll change your name a bit, this kind of thing.
So,
yeah.
And after Franco dies peacefully in his bed, there's this whole transition, and there's this idea within Catalans that, now we have an opportunity for democracy. And so they vote pretty much in favor of the new constitution under Spanish democracy. And that works for about 40 years, but there's this chafing because Catalans want more autonomy. It's very similar to the Scottish situation in many ways, but Spain keeps pulling back. And so this kind of, it all comes to a head in 2010, and this is when there begins to be a really big independence movement. 1 million people in the streets every single year for 8 or 9 years, with people with this movement gathering momentum and saying, we really want, especially we want to be able to say what we want. We want to have a voice in the government. We don't want the Spanish judges to overturn the laws that are created in the Catalan parliament. And that this friction between autonomy and Spain holding back is what really pushes the Catalan independence movement, which continues up until October 1st, 2017, which is when we have this referendum, which Spain says is illegal. And Catalonia says this is the only way we have to express ourselves. And Spain eventually comes in on that day, on October 1st, and beats people, peaceful voters at the polls. And the people have their hands up in the air and say, we want to vote. This is an incredible democratic process. 2.5 million people get to vote that day. And still Spain says no referendum even happened.
Yeah, no, and that was beautifully done also. And I think, again, that's exactly when a lot of our audience will have entered the scene, seeing, especially on Twitter and YouTube, a lot of clips of things happening at polling places that didn't quite seem like Western Europe.
It was an incredible day because there were this very strong, peaceful, grassroots movement, people insisting on voting peacefully, and brutal police action by the Spanish against voters. I mean, it's just like the biggest contrast you could imagine. People trying to vote and then being beaten for it in Spain.
Bujar, switching over to Kosovo. I mean, y'all did it the old-fashioned way, national liberation through guerrilla and civil war. A lot of Americans will know about this because, of course, we came in on your side and bombed Serbia and, of course, helped with the liberation. But can you talk to us about, again, it all seems so clear-cut, right? There was even a military victory, and yet Kosovo still has a nebulous status in the world, is not recognized by folks, seemingly is blessed by the United States. Like, what exactly is the problem? What is the holdup? And how does it play into some of these issues that we're talking about?
All right. Well, I think I'm not going to go so far back in history. I can start maybe with
the Ottoman Empire. No, it's okay. It's okay.
With the Ottoman Empire, exactly. I can start with that. And I think that around the 16th century is when the Ottoman Empire invaded.
Oh, I was kidding, though. You don't have to. Yeah.
And I just want to connect it to nationalism, which is the topic today, because that was when the Battle of Kosovo happened, and which is very, very often wrongly assumed that only Serbs fought, and I guess this is the cornerstone of the Serb nationalism. And actually, in this battle, the people of the Balkans fought against the Ottoman Empire. So this is, I guess, where the whole story really starts with reference to Kosovo, and which has implications in so many ways to this day. Although this is something that happened in the 16th century. So this is what I wanted to say. But anyway, with the Ottoman Empire, then you have 5 centuries of Ottoman occupation, right? And so in the 19th century, you have a kind of gradual liberation of these countries in in the Balkans, also because the Ottoman Empire is becoming weaker and weaker, right? And so in this time, actually, the Albania gained independence, but Kosovo was left out of this sort of territory, and it became part of the so-called First Yugoslavia. Okay, then skipping forward to the Second Yugoslavia, Kosovo was also always marginalized, right? It was always the poorest region in Yugoslavia. There is certain statistics, for example, from the OECD and so on, when they look at the level of development of Yugoslavia, and they, for example, look at the level of development of Slovenia, and it's comparable to, let's say, the level of development of Spain at that time, right, in the 80s. And the level of development in Kosovo is comparable to a third world country, right? So there was a very big inequality in this regard, and it was in many ways also extractive and colonial, if you want, in this way, because a lot of the resources which were acquired de facto, a lot of coal and a lot of energy from Kosovo went de facto to the center and so on. In 1976, I think,
That's how empire works.
yeah. In 1976, I think, if I'm right, I may be wrong by 1 or 2 years, is when Kosovo gains some sort of autonomy, and has the right finally to open universities, so Albanian-speaking universities for the first time in Kosovo, and so on and so on. And with the rise to power of Milosevic, this autonomy is actually taken away, and it's not only taken away, also a lot of people are sacked from their work. And so you have a lot of people who finally who lost their
And
job.
just to help out the audience, 90% of Kosovo is ethnic Albanian, Albanian speaking, etc.
Yes,
the number,
exactly.
right?
So all these 90% or the vast majority of them lost the right to go to work and lost the right to education. So a lot of education was actually in this time done in private homes. So people would educate in private homes and so on and so on. And then you have, of course, the breakout of the war in Bosnia and in Croatia. And this is, in this time, Kosovo was actually doing a peaceful struggle, right? So it was a kind of pragmatic pacifism, what I like to call pragmatic pacifism. And then, of course, with the repression and so on, with this kind of 10 years of blank, which surprisingly nobody mentions. Everyone mentions just the war. Nobody mentions this kind of period, which was before that. Then you had the sort of uprising and you had a struggle. And then the NATO intervened, right, headed by the United States mostly. And you had a sort of protectorate, an international protectorate, and you had a peacekeeping force. Until 2008, you still have a peacekeeping force, but the number is very, very much reduced. And in 2008, Kosovo declared independence. And so now, getting to your question, finally, the reason why Kosovo is not recognized is because of alliances, and it's purely political. Of course, that Serbia has been aligned for very long with Russia, and Russia will not recognize Kosovo for this very simple reason. This is one reason. Another reason is, for example, why Spain wouldn't recognize Kosovo, and that is because of Catalonia, or why Greece wouldn't recognize Kosovo, and this is because of Cyprus. And so you have this kind of very big problems because Kosovo, in a sense, is feared to set a precedent for these other nations or these other communities, which then want to claim the right for self-determination themselves. Now, is it legitimate to have self-determination? Yes, totally. Because the question actually that you have to ask here is, what would be the alternative to that? So what is the alternative to self-determination? Is it subjugation? Is it non-determination?
Right.
So this is the question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think digging in, especially to some of those coalition issues, are really important. But first, I actually want to ask Ben, because in both of these other cases, we're hearing so much about, it not being a political project, but as much a cultural project that people can point to. We are always hearing with Scottish independence, it does seem like a pragmatic answer to Thatcherism, to neoliberalism, to people who want kind of more social democracy, and they see really are. But is there also a cultural component? Do we see, like you see in Ireland, say, like, a lot of young people relearning old languages, etc., or is this really kind of a progressive political project that lives outside of that world?
Well, within the movement, within the people who've always advocated for independence, there's always been a cultural component that a lot of the sort of founders of the movement and the people who've carried it forward have been people who've been very interested in Scottish history, literature, and languages, Gaelic, and so on. But I think to their frustration, they always found it was very, very difficult to generate a popular political appeal in Scotland that would be sufficiently broad-ranging to win over enough votes to get them into office and to support independence. And so for that reason, they've tended to pivot away from making a pure cultural argument and making more of, as you say, a kind of socioeconomic argument, making a kind of social democratic argument. And I guess in part that's also because Scotland in the mid-late 20th century was quite a labourist political culture. It was a political culture that was dominated by heavy industry and then the decline of heavy industry, by trade unionism and by the Labour Party. And so in a way, nationalists have often sort of pivoted off of that to say, well, in a sense, the sort of nationalism of Scotland is the kind of Labour nationalism. And so that's how we have to kind of present it. And the sort of electoral project the Scottish nationalists always had was basically how to win lots of votes off of the Labour Party in Scotland, who were the dominant party up until the early 21st century. So in that sense, there's culture in the background, but the broad appeal and the pitch that the SNP are making at the moment is a socioeconomic one. It's saying, and a democratic one. It's saying that Scotland is a distinct political community that has distinct political preferences that need to be realised and can't be recognised because of the dominance of the Conservative Party in London.
It's like in the argument of representation, sort of more than liberation, I guess, in some ways that you could say that. Liz, can you break down? I think this is a communications question as much as a political question, but how the words sort of patriotism for Spain versus nationalism for Catalan, how are these two things flavored differently in the media talk around the independence movement, and how are they weaponized by both sides?
Sure. That's a really good question. When you talk about nationalism, we often think instantly of 1945 Germany. That's the image of nationalism as Nazi, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, and in fact, nationalism is really it's a celebration of a diversity of cultures by highlighting each one. There are differences between Catalonia and Scotland and Kosovo and different parts of France and different parts of wherever the world. Each place has this identity, which offers this incredible wealth to the world of nations. That's a wonderful thing. It's like the diversity in biology. And so for a huge country like Spain or like France or like the UK or the United States or Russia to say, no, you're being nationalist by wanting to speak Catalan or wanting to have your culture. You should really only speak Spanish. It's accusing the other people of what you were doing yourself.
Right.
In fact, Catalan nationalism is, I think, very much like Scottish nationalism. I know less about Kosovo, but I assume it's very similar. It's a very welcoming country. We have had huge demonstrations in favor of welcoming refugees, in favor of equal rights for all various different groups, in favor of being solidarity with other communities around the world. This is not an exclusive ethnic cleansing kind of thing. In fact, you don't have to be. One of the interesting things that I always find about Catalonia is that 70% of the people who live here are descendants of one or more parents that are from someplace else, and that is considered a positive thing. So where maybe Spain considers itself patriotic, they say Catalans are nationalists and that's exclusive, and it's not. The Catalan parliament only in the last elections has a new xenophobic party, and it's not a Catalan party, it's a Spanish party. There have been no Catalan xenophobic parties in the Catalan parliament ever until, and then that's just not one of the values that.
And I want to build on that because, working in Kosovo, seeing other things around, it occurs to me, and Bujar, I'll give you first bite at this though, but that having sort of progressive nationalist or, whatever you want to call it, projects does actually blunt the growth of kind of right-wing populism, nativism. I was just struck when I first landed at the sort of folks who made up the rallies for Vetvendoja, the Self-Determination Party, and what they were asking for. And not to be totally, I was fresh off the plane, so I immediately jump into cliches, and I'm like, these don't look like people I would hang out with necessarily, and yet they're demanding things like more queer representation, some things like, actually sort of progressive things. Do you think in terms of, so two-part question, and it's tricky. One, do you think that telling these stories and infusing it does give people different paths to positive things to go through? And do you think the resistance to it also just comes from an inconvenience of what you were saying before, these global alliances that have been a certain way basically since the end of World War II, but certainly since certainly since the 1990s? And is this just, you don't fit into the story? Everybody who's an independent nation, stand up. Oh, you were too late. You sit down.
Yeah, well, I think that what you're touching upon is there needs to be distinction, right? Because nationalism, yes, does have a negative connotation because of historical facts, as you mentioned, and so on and so on. Yeah. But we need to make a distinction because nationalism does not, or the concept of nation is not always exclusionary, right? It's not always exclusionary towards minorities and so on and so on. So we can make a distinction between, let's say, ethnocentric nationalism, and we can make a distinction between civic nationalism. And so I think this is the later one, which Kosovo wanted to establish, a sort of civic nationalism. You can see it, or which the kind of foundational fathers of Kosovo wanted to establish in Kosovo, and you can see it in the map. You can see it in the flag. You can see it in the flag. You can see it in the anthem. You can see it in like how the laws are of representation are built, and so on and so on. And so there was never a question that Kosovo would be this sort of ethnocentric kind of nationalist state, which would only always belong to the Albanians and so on. But within that country, there should be also a kind of, it should be democratic, and democracy also involves the right of the majority, right, for self-determination, for representation, international representation, and so on and so on. And I think this is a kind of right which was denied to Kosovo for many years, and now we're like 22 years after the war, or after the liberation of Kosovo, and Kosovo is still not part of, let's say, international organizations and so on and so on. And this is the kind of sentiment, or this is the kind of aspects which really fueled this sentiment of nationalism in Kosovo. And then you had growing demands, let's say, for unification with Albania, although I don't know how much popular that is actually within Kosovo. I would doubt that would pass, but that is my personal opinion. And this is what fuels actually this sort of nationalist sentiment. Now we have sometimes, we also were trying to avoid, in political terms, trying to avoid, let's say, this sort of Bosnia kind of effect in Kosovo, where you have, as you said, 90% of Albanians, but then you have, kind of minority which is blocking everything, and then you cannot pass anything in the parliament, and so on and so on. And this used to be very often the case. This used to be the case because of internal constraints, but mostly because of external constraints. So yeah, when you look at the question of, when you look at Kosovo, you have so many decision-making factors. You have you have the United States, for example, which is still kind of active in Kosovo. You have the European Union, which is split. So it is pretty much ambiguous, which I don't know, you cannot be neutral in a moving train, right? As someone said. So this is also creating many different problems. So I think what you're talking about is precisely this, why it fueled nationalist sentiment. With regard to Vetvendoje, it is very interesting because they are not nationalist in a classic sense, as you said earlier, right? So they're left-leaning party. So they do not deny actually any sort of rights for minorities and so on, but they do empathize the rights of the majority.
Sorry, there's some noise going on behind me. No, but that absolutely makes sense. And Ben, I want to kick us back over to you. This question of international alliances. Wouldn't it just be easier? We have a world that functions in a certain way. So let me be that guy for a second, and I'm going to ask you an annoying question. So Scotland is independent. Doesn't this mean the end of the UK? Won't Wales, Cornwall? Where does this all end? A fractured universe that goes down to its smallest component. How can we justify this? How do you justify this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the argument, or one of the arguments against Scottish independence that would be made by advocates of the United Kingdom, which is to say, well, the United Kingdom can be a very positive force because it's a bringing together of these different nations that can work together, and yeah, I mean, there is a kind of question about does every nation need a state, or can you have these kind of multinational constructions? I mean, I think the sort of problem that the advocates of the United Kingdom have is that historically and in recent years, the United Kingdom has always been justified on the basis that it's a voluntary union. That's how it's been legitimated. Uh, Going back for years and years and years, British politicians have always said, if Scotland wants to vote for independence, it can have independence. And of course, they said that at a time when support for independence was very low. But nonetheless, the legitimation of the United Kingdom has always been it is voluntary, it is democratic. And so that then means that they're in a difficult position when one constituent nation expresses the view that it wants to have a referendum or to reconsider the terms of affiliation to the United Kingdom. And so in a way, the kind of advocates of the United Kingdom are boxed in a bit by that rhetoric that they've always used. And it's a bit, I mean, it's different from Spain. It's a sort of different approach from the Spanish approach, because the UK approach has been to say, no, you can, if you want to, you can vote to go, and we'll even organise a referendum for you to do it in 2014. So it's a different kind of statecraft from the centre in London than you get in Madrid. But it does mean that they now face these kind of continued demands about wanting another referendum. And at the moment, the problem they have is they're trying to resist having another referendum when they've said for many, many years that it's perfectly possible for this kind of democratic decision making to take place because of the particular character of the United Kingdom as a voluntary union that brought together these nation states. Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, the mechanism should be baked into the cake there, if not anywhere. It's almost like the Constitution of Texas famously actually has an escape hatch in it. I do think that's interesting. And Liz, I'm just trying to remember what you said. We spoke yesterday, and you said to a similar question, sure, like everyone who actually feels this way should be able to demand it. And I think when you examine it, that there will be very few cases when looked at that it wouldn't make sense for a people who have so decided to do so. That is premised on the idea of maybe referendums, which aren't always everyone's favorite, democratic process. Can you just expand a little bit on, like, are referendums the only mechanism to sort of determine a people? We know that there's sort of a flawed form of direct democracy. Expand on that. Sorry, I pitched you a weird one, but there it is.
No, that's quite all right. Right. So, I mean, I think that the argument, if we let Catalonia be independent or we let Kosovo be independent, then everybody will want to. That's a straw man argument. Actually, not everybody wants to. Texas, like you say, has their escape clause, but when there was a movement to have Texan independence, I think there was about 100,000 people who signed the petition, and there's 45 million people in Texas. So, they don't really want to. I don't think California wants to either, despite perhaps reasons that they might want to. But it seems to me, so you said, what are the other methods for becoming a state? Well,
finding out consensus of the people. It's a tricky thing, right?
Well, consensus or legitimacy, because one of the tried and true methods of creating a state is having a war and killing people, and that's considered totally legitimate. Somehow, having a referendum is seen as less legitimate than that, and having a people's movement that organizes mass demonstrations and organizes a referendum that the state refuses to recognize, somehow that's not legitimate, but killing people is, which is something that doesn't really make sense to me. But the overall question about can anybody have a state, or is self-determination, a fundamental right? I mean, I think that's obviously yes. In fact, it's part of the UN Charter that a nation that identifies as such because of its history, because of its language, because of its culture, simply because it wants to have this, it wants to feel represented. It wants to feel like it has a voice about its own affairs. That's the basis of this. It's the basis of it is freedom and it's democracy, and it's saying we want to organize our society in such a way that makes sense to us. And nobody gets to say that you can't do that. There's no just because Ferdinand and Isabel got married 500 years ago, somehow Catalans are forever part of Spain because they say so. That's not the way it works. That the democracy must have the consent of the governed. And so when a nation comes together and says, we need to figure out how we're going to feel represented, they don't feel represented when the Spanish courts overturn law after law after law in the Catalan parliament, because Catalan society tends to be more progressive and more left-leaning than the Spanish one. And so this autonomy, which was supposed to be the solution here, and letting, in quotes, Catalonia have its own laws and then overturning them means that relationship is flawed and it doesn't work. So that's where Catalans say, okay, well, the autonomy doesn't work, so we need to look for better solutions to feeling this representation, to living in a democratic society where we get to decide how we make our laws. And Spain said no, you can't. Spain continues to say no to this day. And in fact, after the referendum that we insisted on having, and even though they beat us, and that they put all of our political leaders in jail and sent them into exile. I mean, that's not democracy in any shape or form. Peaceful civic leaders are in jail at this moment for holding a referendum in Catalonia that represents a majority opinion of the people here. 80% of the people believe that this conflict of ideas about who should govern this country, believe that it should be solved by referendum. So referendums may not be ideal, but they're better than war. And they're a democratic way of listening to people. What I would prefer would be that, Spain says, all right, let's see if really there's a majority of people who want to have their own country. Why can't we vote on it? Why can't we have a lengthy educational process saying, all right, well, what is it that you want? And what is it that you don't have? And how would it be different? And not the fear campaign, for example, that they had in Scotland, where they said, watch out, because if you become an independent country, you're not going to be a part of the EU. And look what happened.
Yeah, totally. You don't get it anyway.
You don't get it anyway. So this idea that you should be able to have this educational campaign, really have a fair vote, and then the people should be able to decide. That's the best way to figure out who should govern.
I hate to give anyone who's on the opposing side ideas, but the thing that I will say, listening to both you and Ben and Bujar, this is going to be a pivot to you. This is going to be a brilliant thing. It's going to pivot right to you, the whole thing. But what we do in America, and we are master vote suppressors in America, is we wouldn't hold out on having the referendum or the vote. We would just have 30 of them, and each of them would be confusing as to exactly what they were. This is what we do, especially in Texas, right? There's always an election, and it's always about something, and there's always advertising behind it. And so you just, number one, you get tired, you get confused, and then you don't have this sort of high stakes drama game that I don't see them winning in the end, right? I think in the UK, especially, you see sort of Cameron just being like, what are the chances any of this stuff happens? Let's just go for it. And so when you don't have the imagination to think of these things is when it happens. But Bujar, you certainly have plenty of elections in Kosovo, and none of them seem to stick. But of course, this last one for the self-determination movement was the most overwhelming victory of any party, etc. in Kosovo. Do you see this as the desire, as sort of the same thing as an independence movement, just sort of people looking to consolidate their actual self-determination not in a purely political way, but in a movement way. Do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of more in popular power than in legal power, because as we know, that's a very fragile thing in a young nation like Kosovo.
Yeah, well, I wanted to connect first to what Liz said
Oh, please
because
do.
actually not a lot of people know this, but in 1991 Kosovo had a referendum and declared independence, and
I know.
that was not respected by anyone. It was recognized only by Albania. And what I want to say is that the referendums, they have to have a just basis, right? And people have to have this kind of feeling that they are this sort of imagined community and they belong together, as Liz was saying, and so on and so on. And in the case of Kosovo, I think that it is indisputable that that kind of just basis was there, because and this is in a way kind of the absurdity of the issue now in terms of like Serbia not recognizing Kosovo, because how can you know like burn down a country, plunder it, commit genocide, and do all these things, and then in the end say I don't recognize you? So what is the alternative? What is the kind of other way? I mean, this is like saying, you know, Poland should be again part of Germany. It's absolutely absurd, you know, in terms of like the basis for why people in Kosovo want to claim self-determination. Now, to get to your question, I think that yes, I think that the kind of the broad appeal of Vetvendosa was also because of the failure of the past governments. So the failure of the past governments to really kind of stand as kind of Kosovo, right? To kind of self-recognize themselves, I would say, like in that way, because it was always, of course, that the talk was Kosovo is independent and so on and so on, but it was always concessions, 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 and Kosovo was not gaining anything. And I think that this is the reason why people voted for Vetvendosa, because they have a hope that they will change something, and this is a very big majority, and so maybe we have some leverage there, right? So we in the past it was always like fractions, you know, this party has 10%, that party has 12%, and in the end they could never do nothing, and none of the governments could stick also for very long. And so now there's a hope with that there's going to be some change. There are some problems, of course, that now with the pandemic, for example, this is not something very easy to overcome, especially for a country like Kosovo, which is very poor, has limited resources. But yeah, I think that the momentum is good for Vetvendosa, and the work that they do remains to be seen, right? This is something that we cannot judge from now. And I'm personally very hesitant
No, I
to
know.
judge
You can
before.
be even more hesitant with my question here, but it's a quick lightning round, just to end up, which is, and then wait until I finish asking everyone, but is, Ben, will there be a second referendum, and when? Liz, will there be, additional movements, and when? And Bujar, should we anticipate movement in the recognition of Kosovo internationally based on these other places maybe having successful things? So go quick. Ben, you first.
Yeah, I think there will be, but I think it'll be in a few years, because actually I don't think either side really wants to have a referendum right away. The pro-independence side hasn't quite sorted out exactly what it's going to say in terms of what an independent Scotland will look like.
Yeah.
And although it suits them politically to say they want a referendum now, they're probably not ready for it. And meanwhile, the UK side wants to put it off for as long as possible. But I think eventually there has to be another kind of democratic legitimation of the union, or the dissolution of it, because there's now such a kind of passionately held and extensive critique of the union within Scotland that I don't think it's sustainable to keep that going for longer than a few years. So I think there will be, but the kind of micro politics of how you get to having another one is quite complicated, and might take quite a few years to work out.
Liz.
So I want to stress that part of the issue is about alliances, but there's a big piece that's economic and about power. And Spain really, really, really doesn't want to let go 20% of its in taxes, which is Catalonia. And so that would be very, very difficult for them to allow us to have a vote. But will it go away? No, of course not. Not at all. In the last elections, 52% of the people in Catalonia voted for pro-independence parties. That's a majority. It's not a huge majority, but it's a majority, and those people aren't going away. And we still have our political leaders in jail for holding a referendum. So that's another motor that keeps people moving and say, you can't just like turn away and say, oh, well, sorry, we lost. No, because you can't leave those people in jail unjustly. So there's a slogan that says, we'll do it again, and we will do it again as many times as it takes to get the representation that we believe that every human deserves in a democratic system. How long it will take to happen is anybody's guess. Right now, the Catalans are famous for infighting, and right now that's pretty bad time in terms of that. Right after these elections, they haven't been able to form a coalition government, and everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else.
I think our listeners will have noticed you said independence parties and not independence party, which certainly puts a lot of clarity on the Scottish situation.
Right,
there's a party identified singularly with the movement.
Sure. No, there's three, which is an interesting thing, because then there's sort of a center-right party, a center-center party, and a center-left, and a more left party, which kind of shows the representation it has throughout society. And it's also true that younger people are much more pro-independence than very old people, or people who suffered during the dictatorship, who might be worried about fighting for independence because who knows what will happen. So I think that with time, it's inevitable that we will eventually become independent. How it will happen, I'm not sure, but I know that people aren't just going to give up.
And Bujar, last word. It's not easy. You can be independent, but not really be independent.
No, but as Liz was saying again, I mean, these things that don't go away just because you put them under the carpet. And I mean, there was a big attempt in the, let's say, to assimilate the Catalan language, but it's still there, right? It's flourishing now. And I think this is the same issue with Kosovo. With regard to the recognition, I don't see personally how the big players, let's say Russia or China, are going to move very soon in recognizing Kosovo. That would make like a major change. Like any of the members of the UN Security Council would recognize Kosovo, and that could inspire other countries to recognize Kosovo, because right now we have like a kind of pretty clear cut way in the countries which have recognized Kosovo, and versus the countries that did not recognize Kosovo. And that is one thing. And the other thing is that Serbia is actively working for the de-recognition of Kosovo. So they're going to countries in Africa which recognized Kosovo, for example, and corrupting officials, giving them a lot of money,
and actually flipping them.
Exactly, flipping them to de-recognize us. And so this is the kind of limited capacity that we have as a 2 million, as a 1.7 or 8 million country with very limited resources and very limited diplomatic power also. And so that's why we need alliances, and that's why we need to rely on like powerful countries like the United States and Germany to actually help us in this process. But any kind of small gain, sometimes you have this news and some small island somewhere in the Caribbean recognized Kosovo and so on. Any sort of small news like this is good, because it reaffirms that it can go on. And so I don't know also how much longer it's gonna go. But the only problem is that the damage that is being done to the people of Kosovo is tremendous. People not being able to move freely, all sort of bureaucratic, complications that they have, and so on and so on. So this is a whole generation which is lost because of this sort of difficulties.
Thank you so much, Bujar. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ben. And we'll all have all of you back to get in deeper on this stuff. And thank you all for joining us. And next week, we're going to be digging in deeper on the communications behind the climate debate, a war we seem to be losing. Thank you.
Ciao.